for cloud management tools. Welcome, Jon.
Hey, everybody.
And rounding out our panel is Josh Stella, co-founder and CTO here at Fugue. Hi, Josh.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Awesome. And of course, we have all of you here and want you to be a part of the conversation. So we've made the Zoom chat open to all of you, and it'll remain so throughout the duration of this session. So get your comments and questions in early and often. And so why don't we start with James, since you've kind of put some time in on helping us frame this topic. So why don't you take it away?
Sure, thanks, Drew. So I want to jump kind of right in with what I'll call maybe a rhetorical question or a simple question. And that question kind of is, who owns your compliance? I call this kind of rhetorical because A, I gave you the answer, it's right here on the slide. But more importantly, this is a relatively easy compliance question, and the answer there is you do. Ultimately, if you work in any kind of regulated market that has required compliance, or if your organization has set up compliance requirements of their own, you as the organization are the owners of making sure you're compliant. Where this gets a little bit more interesting is if you twist the question a little and you ask who manages your compliance. And the answer here is more kind of, it depends. So traditionally, we jump right into kind of what this is a version of a diagram some of you may have seen. It looks a lot like the AWS shared responsibility model, except there's no AWS on this diagram. This is what you operate in likely if you run your own data centers. So if you are doing that, you'll notice everything on this is the same color, meaning everything on here you own. The compliance requirements that go with all of your data centers, all of your infrastructure, and all of the application stuff that you're building on top of that really sits on you to not only own, but manage from the bottom up. So this is completely your responsibility. Now,
yeah, James, real quick, I actually do want to comment on that slide.
Yep.
I think I'm glad you posted this one because I came from a very traditional IT background of racking, stacking servers, all the way moved up to, not only provisioning and managing like a server admin in the environment. And, this picture that you have up here really encompasses and shows all the work that goes into a traditional model from, the data center days.
Yeah, and what I really like too is when you compare this with the AWS shared responsibility model, I'm going to take the bottom piece here and I'm going to zoom right in on that, because this is kind of the stuff that when you're talking about racking and stacking, yeah, this is it. This is where you've got your data center, you're racking in your compute, your networking, and all that stuff, and you as the company providing this service to yourself at this point are responsible for all of this. There's a lot on here. I purposely made this slide really complicated to let you know kind of what you're responsible for. And there's basic things like physical security. You're responsible for the physical security in your data center. DRBCP, just a high level, what you're gonna do if there's a disaster. Likely it means you need another data center. There's all the technical compliance stuff, patching, change control, all that sort of stuff. High availability just in a single data center, let alone when you have to worry about hard drives failing all over the place. And then there's all this hardware listed here on the right, which is just a subset likely of the stuff you're dealing with from a hardware software perspective, just to run your infrastructure. And then down there at the bottom, these are just some of the big compliance frameworks that you might be held accountable to. And if there's 2 or 3 of these, yeah, there might be a little bit of overlap, but there's also places where each of these frameworks is going to have special requirements that only they have that apply to some or all of this infrastructure that you're responsible for.
I like that you captured the time server on there. Actually, I've looked at this slides a bunch of times, and it's the first time I'm sitting there centering on that. And that's one thing that people don't really think of in a traditional data center, like, oh, we need a time server, we need a redundant time server across all of it. So it is a busy slide, but it really captures a lot of the stuff that you have to do yourselves.
Yeah, leave it to the security guy to want to make sure that the timestamps are right on all of his logs, right?
But that's an interesting point in that we often think of this pile of stuff on the right. So Jon is, of course, at AWS. I used to work at AWS, and there were a couple of kind of cultural quips that come to mind in looking at this. One is undifferentiated heavy lifting, and we're going to touch on that again, and that's numerous times, I suppose. Usually, so undifferentiated heavy lifting is you doing stuff that doesn't actually directly and in a differentiating way address your customer needs for your product, right? Like running a time server is a pain, it's costly, but it doesn't differentiate you from your competitor because they also have a time server, so who cares? Now, we normally think of this largely in terms of cost, but what we're going to focus on today, and I think might be interesting to folks, is thinking about this from a security perspective. And we're gonna keep coming back to that.
So while you're managing all that stuff on that slide too, I just want to throw in to the mix here, like in the DevOps culture that is today, you're automating all this stuff so that your organization can shift left, right? Because that's what everybody's doing. That's the way technology is moving. So if you're still running your data centers, there's a whole new level of requirements just to keep up with the state of technology and help your organization make this shift to the left and put the power in developers' hands and get it out of the operations teams and the core data center functionality and responsibilities. Not an easy task. So there's another way to look at this though, and especially for smaller companies that maybe don't have any legal or regulatory compliance requirements on them, you're not doing any of this. And why does any of this matter to me? And it's a really great question. I've worked for plenty of startups that were smaller and definitely didn't necessarily worry about compliance or any real regulatory things. It's a little different world today with things like CCPA and GDPR that you kind of have to deal with regardless of your industry. But at the same time, some of the more complex things like PCI and ISO and SOC, you may not have to worry about. You think, but there's this concept of you have a product and you want to sell that product. And if you want people to buy your product, especially if it's a technology product, and especially in today's world where there's so many risks around cybersecurity and people coming after information, you know, measurable compliance is a really great way to show your customers that you are following industry standard best practices, and really give your customers some peace of mind as to why they should buy your product and to let them know that you're really looking out for them.
James, on the previous slide that you had there, why does this matter to me? I think you actually captured it there. If you think of the really, in an enterprise level company, a lot of the departments are siloed. You have a department for security, you have a department for data center operations, for networking, and they, you know, it takes a lot to go through each one of those to actually accomplish a task. So in order to do just one thing with your security or your compliance, you might have to go through multiple departments or iterations. So I think that's why, you know, it, you know, does matter, is because now you're kind of condensing that. So I think you bring up a good point on this.
Thanks, I was trying to. So now I'm going to take us to hopefully something everybody's seen. And this is the actual AWS shared responsibility image taken directly from AWS. So it should be very accurate. What is great about this is it's very clear where you as the customer own on this spectrum and what AWS is here to help manage for you. Now, I very specifically say to help manage for you, not to own for you, because as with all of the compliance services and features and functionality that AWS has, there are rules you have to follow depending on the compliance frameworks that you're trying to have on your own side. There are rules you have to follow and best practices you have to follow in order to get this support from AWS. But if you do that, you're able to basically shift the responsibility of this entire orange section to AWS, lean on them and all of the expertise they have focused on this stuff, and you can shift those resources inside your own environment and your own teams to actually supporting all the stuff in the top level, which is where you add value to your customers and to your bottom line. It really lets you focus on what's important to you and important to your organization, and most importantly, what's important to your customers.
You know, to chime in on that, as the CTO at Fugue, a significant chunk of my job is looking at stuff in this blue area and trying to kill it and move it to the orange, right? So we've got customer data. We manage customer data. You really can't push that off. You can leverage the heck out of these services and the features they have to secure that data if you understand how to use them, and leverage AWS's powers and capabilities there, which is wise to do. So for example, doing things like using KMS keys and doing key rotation regularly and all that kind of stuff, using secrets manager, et cetera. But there's a bunch of stuff in this blue that if you really start using the cloud in a more cloud native way, you don't even have to think about anymore. Operating systems. I'm going to talk later about Lambda and the beauty of the wonderful experience of no longer patching operating systems. So I think the way I view this, both from a cost perspective, which is usually how this is discussed, but I mean, my background is heavy national security and cloud. And so I'm always thinking about, you know, and Fugue is a security software vendor, you know, doing security for cloud systems. And we ourselves are hosted in AWS as a SaaS. So we're always thinking about this. How much can we get rid of stuff in the blue so that our engineers aren't worried about either doing the work in terms of that undifferentiated heavy lifting and incurring costs on us, but also putting the security boundary further onto the cloud provider by using the higher order services. So
if you're one of those organizations that, you know, is running your own data center, we've got this complicated slide. I took a nice screenshot of it, made it a little too small so you can't read it on purpose, because I don't want you to have to worry about this anymore. We're lifting and shifting. We're moving to AWS. Now what I want you to worry about is the one thing that's important in making sure your AWS infrastructure stays up and running. Once you safely set it up and secure it, you need to make sure you write a check to Uncle Jeff every month to pay for the services that AWS is providing and helping you out with. So what does that mean once you move forward? Well, that slide kind of goes away. You simplify a lot. But if you do a lift and shift, you're likely still supporting a lot of compute and a lot of stuff that is very similar to your data center. So there are still things that compliance is going to drag back in or keep on your plate. Things like vulnerability management across all your servers. You still have to manage that. Antivirus on your servers. That's still your responsibility. IPS, IDS, backups, automated failover. You're running a data center in AWS at this point. So even though AWS can help you with this stuff, likely if you're doing a vanilla lift and shift, the responsibility of this stuff still sits on your shoulders.
So, and James, that's a really good slide, because a lot of people think when doing a lift and shift or moving to the cloud, hey, I just want to get there. But if you take the time to invest and look at utilizing all the native AWS services and leveraging them, you actually do that shift of the responsibility where AWS is handling a lot of the heavy load and doing that one, and you can focus more on your security and your application and everything. So it's a really good slide there to kind of capture the stuff you still own by doing a traditional lift and shift.
Well, you did a great way of segueing to my next slide. I appreciate that, because this is going to be phase two. If you've done your lift and shift, what's next? Well, what's next is you're going to take advantage of AWS managed services. You're going to start to dip your toes into the orange section. That is the higher level part where they're actually managing your databases for you. What do you gain from this? Well, you gain a bunch of stuff. A lot of Amazon services, when properly configured, give you automatic failover in an availability zone, potentially even in a region, meaning if they lose all of Western California, Western US, and you're set up to also run in Eastern US, your application can fail over if you build to take advantage of those services. Automated backups, multi-AZ reliability is built into all of Amazon's best practices, and multi-region reliability can be there if you start to shift your apps that direction. And here's just a few of the, literally at this point, I'm guessing thousands of services that AWS offers that fall under this, guys. Like RDS and DynamoDB for doing your database stuff. If you're using something like Elasticache for, or if you're using something like Redis and Memcache for caching, you can lean on Elasticache services. If you're doing containers, EKS and ECS can help you do your orchestration. And if you can lean into Fargate, they can also manage your compute and shift a lot of the responsibility of managing actual hosts away from you. And then I could go on forever. There are literally, probably not gazillions, but there are literally thousands of services that are offered.
You know, James, as you're talking through that, I've held for many years now, and I've spent about the last decade just focused on cloud, and particularly with a focus on security. But the way that I think of the cloud is not a remote data center. I think of it as a big distributed computer. And the reason I bring that up is if you start thinking about, lift and shift is great. Go ahead and lift and shift stuff. You're going to get advantages from that. You're going to learn cloud. You're going to be able to leverage the scale of cloud. There are a bunch of benefits you're going to get. Even if you lift and shift the right way with reserved instances and so on, you're going to save money and you're not going to have to run data centers. But as you really start using cloud natively, and by natively, I mean leaving behind your assumptions about how we're doing computing. And we had one of our attendees here say, let's see, cloud options are only an iteration of data center architecture. I really don't agree with that. There are whole new patterns that you can use that AWS are kind of putting out there for us to migrate to. And so when you start thinking about things like, you know, even between RDS and DynamoDB, DynamoDB is more managed, right? DynamoDB is just a thing in the sky into which you throw data and query, whereas RDS, you're thinking more about, you know, managing your database. You're not thinking about patching the version of the database and so on, but, you know, it has a little more on that line between. And so generally speaking, and by the way, we at Fugue use RDS. We use some of these, you know, not the most managed, most cloud native, most big giant distributed computer kind of services. We have a mix, and you're probably going to too. But the reason I bring this up is when you think about these more abstracted or higher order services, and I would argue DynamoDB is one on the data persistence side, things like step functions. You know, you've got queues in here. Well, step functions behind the scenes are using queues, but you're not having to do it yourself. So as you climb that stack into those higher order services and just deal with it as a big distributed computer, when you do that, you are actually pushing more of the underlying infrastructure responsibility for security onto AWS, who do this all day, every day. And I can't name names here, but I was in a meeting at a 5-sided building right near Washington, D.C. back in the day. And obviously, I'm not going to share anything that I know that is sensitive or classified. But a guy with the flag officer marking said, "I've seen your AWS's operations in their data centers, and I know what we do. And you guys do this at least as well as we do, if not better." So as you're as a vendor, as a software vendor, and by the way, James, this is awesome for us because it's wonderful when we can do something together with one of our customers like you at Red Ventures, you know, and really talk through these issues. So thank you for that, and also thank you, John, from AWS, obviously. But you know, as a vendor, when we talk to our customer, it's really great for us to say, hey, AWS is handling that part of it because folks now know that they can be trusted to do that and are very, very secure. So sorry, I was a bit long-winded there and I interrupted you. I'll let you
well, keep rolling. I want to go back to the comment that was made that you pointed out. And I'm gonna kind of rephrase it a little bit and say, if in fact cloud services were just the next iteration of the data center, unless your business is running data centers, so what? Pay somebody else to run it, focus on your core competency, which is making money, serving your customers and giving them what they need, which could be running a data center. Cool, carry on, keep doing that, do a good job. If it's not though, why would you focus on that as part of your business when you could shift those resources towards supporting your business and supporting your customers? So this is where I get excited, because this is where we really get into where AWS is starting to really be a great partner. It allows us to lean into AWS on these services, and they keep them compliant for us. Now, I've got my asterisk here. There are guidelines you have to follow. There's best practices that you have to keep in mind when you're building out your infrastructure. If you need to be SOC 2, then you need to go and research what services you can use from AWS and how you have to configure them to be SOC 2 compliant. As an example, PCI, same thing. Responsibility, you still have some in how you implement the services, but if you implement them according to AWS's guidelines, you can lean on them for a lot of the heavy lifting with your compliance.
And James, just
by
to
the
touch
way,
on, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, thanks, John. Just very, very briefly, this is not about Fugue as a product, but I do want to make the comment that if you use Fugue and point it at your AWS stuff, we'll tell you where you're in and out of compliance. And there's a version of Fugue that's completely free to use forever that will help guide you on that. So that's kind of what we do for a living. But John, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, so James, this slide, as very simplistic as it is, I really want to touch on some of there are 13 compliancy programs that are part of the shared responsibility model that AWS handles, from SOC, PCI, FedRAMP to HIPAA. And just to kind of encompass the number of AWS services, and it's hard for me to keep up, I think we're at 170 plus, and do not quote me on that one. But for SOC alone, there are 113 services as of this morning, yes, I counted them, that are underneath the SOC program. And think of FedRAMP moderate for the East and West. There's 101 services that are underneath that. So AWS is doing their part in to make sure that these services are compliant for these programs. So you can take that and ultimately roll that into your application, and you inherit those compliancies. So I just think that's a big part of this.
Cool, I agree. And it's been great for us as an organization. It's been really helpful. So because I get excited, I forget things. This is my I'm forgetting things and I need to move along slide. Unfortunately, I'm not cool enough to be announcing a new video game. This symbol for old timers like me, this symbol means a lot more than just functional compute. But what I want to shift to next is really talking about and kind of setting up Josh here about Lambda and Lambda step functions. So this is the third phase of your move to the cloud. You've done your lift and shift if you needed to. You may have been a startup who got to start in the cloud natively. Maybe you were already using containers and not even managing that much EC2. That would be great. But when you really want to get to a point where what your focus is on is delivering value to your customer, Lambda is the direction you're going to find yourself going. Because in this world, picking on just vulnerability management alone, you have to worry about one thing and one thing only. That's your code. Now, if you're using third-party dependencies that you download off of GitHub, okay, you have to worry about that too. But your code is the main thing and the only thing that you have to worry about. The infrastructure supporting it, as long as you follow all the best practices, AWS has your back. They're going to manage the compliance in that orange box. We've done what Josh pointed to. We've moved that orange up as far as we can. We've pushed everything down onto AWS's shoulders. We're relying on them to help us navigate while we get to build our value add. This is where us as builders, we get to take advantage of everything AWS provides, and we get to run. So that means all this stuff on the right, it's either completely gone because we're not, for example, running containers, so we don't need to worry about runtime protection for containers, or AWS is handling it up to the compliance requirements behind the scenes for us in these managed services. And this is such a huge win for organizations that want to focus on adding value to their customers. Wow, speechless. I like it. So here we are. This is
Hey man,
the
anytime you can put a Lambda character on the screen as like a Lisp programmer going back to the 80s, it just kind of makes my day that anyone even cares about that anymore. And you know, our friends out in Seattle who made those games made me happy when they pasted it on the front too. So
Yeah,
thank you for that.
agreed.
I
So
apologize.
this is
I wasn't familiar with the symbol in the previous context. I'm not saying I'm young, but I'm not.
That's
Fair
okay,
enough.
John. I am quite old, and that's fine. That's fine to say.
I'm very familiar and a very big fan. So, so this is where we get to where if you can shift into Lambda as the compute for your environment, for your services, it's the ultimate shift left for your engineers because they just have to worry about writing their code, testing their code, building their code, deploying their code, keeping their code compliant. And they don't have to worry about all the infrastructure or the majority of the infrastructure that supports that. You can lean on AWS and lean into them to help manage that kind of stuff for you. And Josh,
I think this is turning over to me. So I just realized I was told by Drew and Sivia here. There's a fella. I won't. His initials are GW. So GW. You've been sending chats to the panelists, so only us panelists can see them. And when we reply just to the panelists, I'm not sure you can see our replies. So if you can't, say something in the chat and we'll get back to you. Let's see. Yeah. I think we touched on a couple of your comments, but again, feel free to follow up. And if the chat is disconnected because we're only responding to panelists, you know, say something again, and we'll see that. I can see some replies. Okay, you didn't see my replies. Sorry, GW. I will, when I'm done talking, get back to you in the chat. So the first thing.
I did the same thing. I put GW in the thing to make sure it went out to him, but I did notice his last comment only went to the panelists. So it's a little hard for people to follow on in our conversation. I won't go through any of those that he did post, but he knows what's going on that one. I did post it out to everybody. That's what I'm doing. So if people see me looking this way, I'm trying to respond to some of the chat to keep people engaged.
So just for those of you who might have missed it, GW is the one who said that cloud options are an iteration of data center. We talked about that a little bit, and I'm going to go into here why I really disagree with that. And I think that there's a much better way to think of cloud and deal with cloud. And we at Fugue have reaped huge benefits from not thinking of cloud as just an iteration of data center, but instead addressing it as a native new platform. And then he also asked about migration wizards to help with the complexity. That's a really interesting question. When you're dealing with fundamentally new architectures, and cloud is native cloud is a fundamentally new architecture. You can make an argument that you could have built, these big giant distributed systems that use asynchronous communications rather than synchronous, API calls with well-defined contracts. I mean, you could have built that stuff. Some people did. I have before. God, you don't want to. So it's really a new way of doing stuff if you deal with it natively, which is why my first slide referring to everything James just said and John just said is what he said. This is really true. Now let's see, I'm really boring in my slides. So I only have one other slide. So James, if you could go to the next one.
Real quick before we do that.
Oh yeah, go for it.
If you are looking to do the lift and shift though, and you are looking for wizards and support in doing that, AWS, that's what people like John are here for. Get in touch with him afterwards. He'd be more than happy, I'm sure, to connect you with resources that can help you find. There's a ton of tools, there's a ton of documentation, a ton of support for that out there. So don't hesitate to reach out. They're super helpful.
Yeah, James, that's actually a good point on that one. So I was replying back to GW. Asked specifically around migrations and the complexity. There's database migrations, there's you know, I don't want to say traditional lift and shift migrations, but if there's servers that you would like to move over, it will capture and put it on EC2 for you. There's a bunch of stuff. Reach out to me on that one. You know, my Twitter is @ Jon Myer. You can always message me on there. My DMs are open. I try to reply to everybody as much as possible. If not, you can hit up James, Josh, Drew. They know the right people to contact.
Yeah, and we work with John. He's awesome. You know, AWS as an org are very responsive to these things and are great at helping like guide you through this kind of you know, maturity cycle that you're going to go through. Because that's what doing cloud ends up being. And I'm going to describe Fugue's evolution on cloud from when the company was founded. And I came from AWS, so I was really, really well familiar with all these cloud services, but it was a few years ago. And so we built a version of the system that we provide using kind of earlier generation cloud technologies of a few years ago. And recently we completely re-architected it about 18 months ago to fully leverage everything that the cloud can now offer. And it's been a spectacular success from a security perspective, but also from a customer perspective, from our management, et cetera. And I'm going to walk through that in some detail. So this is a wall of text, and I'm sorry for that, but I want you to focus on the lines for a second. And particularly the two that matter most, right, are the top set where it says Fugue customers. And on the left, there are 4 things our customers used to have to do, and that's gone down to 1 by re-architecting it. And that's what we at Fugue care about most, right, is making the system that we build, the application, the service that we provide, as easy to use as possible. And so that reduction going from the EC2 based self-hosted version to the SaaS version, you know, reducing that footprint of what, you know, James has to deal with when Red Ventures use Fugue, for example, is very, very important to us and at the very front of our minds. The second row, which is us, what we have to do, that got smaller too. And it doesn't appear to have gotten a lot smaller, but in reality, it got a lot smaller as we evolved and matured the product into using these higher order services. Primarily, we're based on Lambda and Step Functions now, whereas before we were on EC2. Our life in, you know, we're a startup. We have a small engineering team. They're awesome. You know, they do great work, but AWS has an army compared to us. So we want AWS to build things that we leverage. And by changing our architecture, we have really allowed our engineering team to focus on delivering value to our customers, which we can really rapidly iterate now. And then finally, the bottom one is kind of what we're pushing off onto AWS. And you can see on the left, we were dealing with more of this ourselves, and on the right, it's bigger. So this is what you want. This is a key way to think about architecture from a security perspective, as well as a cost and other perspective. But today we're focused on security when you're dealing with cloud. I'm going to walk through these a little bit and describe the 2 generations of the product and what we've seen. So the first generation of Fugue, Fugue is a product that does security and compliance for your cloud infrastructure. We'll visualize your whole infrastructure. We use Open Policy Agent to tell you whether or not the things in your cloud infrastructure are compliant with, you know, standards like HIPAA or GDPR or CIS or NIST. We've also learned over time that those are inadequate to actually securing your infrastructure. So we write our own rules based on real world hacks out there to tell you if you're susceptible to those. And we also, of course, give you the ability to write your own. So that's what we do for a living. I mentioned my background was kind of a blend between high tech and startups and national security. About half my career in national security. In-Q-Tel, we're an early investor in Fugue. That's the investment arm of the American intelligence agencies, although there's nothing fishy there. They wanted to use our product, so they invested in us. So the first version of our product was developed on EC2. It was developed on EC2 because This was a number of years ago, and that seemed to make the most sense. The first version of the Fugue product was self-hosted by our customer. So the way we would deliver this is we would have an Amazon machine image that if you purchase the product from us, we would share with you, and you could launch into your infrastructure, and we completely automated how all the deployment went, where we would build the VPC that contained it. We would not allow any, I mentioned earlier, ingress ports are the devil if you're thinking about having a really secure application. So everything was done through asynchronous queues. So we built all the queues. And what that meant for our customers is they would have to deploy and maintain that product in their AWS account. So when you think about that shared security model, by us having a solution that they could host in their own account, it actually moves some things onto them from a shared security perspective between our customer and Fugue. We made sure initially that the AWS account and services were configured safely. So for example, our VPC network that we would build had 0 ingress ports. But then the customers got to worry about keeping track of that because somebody could change it, right? They had to manage access to the product for the users inside of their company. And then also they had to pay AWS to run the EC2 instance and the queues and so on, right? So that's the early version. Well, when we went to a completely Lambda step function based software as a service model, and those things are, by the way, related. Our ability to go to a software as a service model has to do with our leveraging those services at AWS. That really collapsed for our customers. So all James or any of our other customers, SAP or anyone else who use our product, all they have to do is manage access to the product. I'm not saying that's trivial. You know, we support SSO and role-based access controls and all that stuff, but it's a much shorter list than it used to be. And they immediately get the benefits of us making updates and changes to the service, which happen about every 2 weeks, sometimes faster, rather than having to do maintenance and deployment and keep up with our production schedule. So, so it's made a more secure product that's much easier for our customers to use and much cheaper for them to run and is safer for them. But what has it done for us? And this is, if you're thinking about building stuff on cloud, this part you're going to care about too, right? We used to have to manage the application security. We had to manage and secure AMIs, operating system security. I'm a long-time like Unix nerd. I never want to deal with operating systems on servers again. It should be a thing of the past. As James was saying about Lambda, you know, just run your code and let the big global computer deal with the operating system. That's really what Lambda is. And the security of our libraries. We had to build and manage queues, SQS queues for comms. We were building whole libraries. I had PhD computer scientists who work for us coming to me saying, Josh, I've built this amazing library for managing, you know, once and only once delivery in a many-to-many mapped queuing system with, you know, timeouts on queues. And I'm like, that's really cool. But that's not what we are offering our customers as value, right? It's cool we could do that, but I don't want to do that. And so with step functions, we don't have to do that anymore. But building out libraries to manage the queues, securing the configuration of all of the above in all of our customers, and worrying about anything they might do that might make a mistake. And then finally, when we got to auditing, we were dealing with so much infrastructure configuration and componentry that the auditors would, you know, have a lot to go through. So where we are now, we use a little bit of Fargate, but barely any. It's pretty much Fugue is all lambdas and step functions. And by the way, we do close to 1 billion policy evaluations a day on our infrastructure. So we're operating at really large scale, which we had to make no architectural changes to get to, just some tweaking along the way. We manage our automatic product updates. Of course, we have to do application security, right? If you write crummy code, bad guys are going to find it and you're going to regret it. We have to make sure Lambda itself is secured, and the context in which it runs is secured, but that is radically reduced attack surface versus running operating systems on VMs and building VP, and you still have VPCs. And by the way, what we do to manage that is we point the Fugue service at the infrastructure that runs the Fugue service, and it tells us if we're getting anything wrong. And so when the SOC 2 auditors came out and said, we need 2 days to go through everything you guys do, and they said, okay, show us how you're doing operating system patching. We said, well, we don't manage any operating systems. And there was this kind of pregnant pause, like, haven't heard that one before, don't really believe you. But it's true, because there is an operating system there, but we can just reference AWS's compliance for them managing that operating system that's running ultimately the I was going to say container, but I know better. The thing that runs the Lambda, that's on AWS. It's not on us, right? And so we can refer to them, which helps our customers because we're a small company. And so there's a natural greater skepticism for what we have to say than, AWS and all of the scrutiny they've been through. So we can leverage that very effectively. And then finally, what we've pushed onto AWS are things like managing session-based unique credentials on every single request that goes through the stack, from the application load balancer through the functions to the database, et cetera, operating system security, and of course, obviously underlying physical infrastructure, hypervisor level stuff, we're not concerned with at all. So I think we're 45 in, which is, I believe, where we said we would, where I would stop talking, and either other panelists can say something, or we can take some questions. I don't know. Back over to, I don't know, Drew.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like off the top of my head, I'd be curious to see, what James and Jon might have to say about kind of our shift toward more of a cloud native, model on AWS.
So yeah, if
go ahead, James.
If we go back to like where the second question I asked, and I'll jump way back up there real quick. So now when you see who manages your compliance, you see you have a lot of control actually over who manages your compliance. You have a lot of different options in how you build your applications, where you host them, how far you lean on AWS for the shared and take advantage of the shared responsibility model. And you can really see how even companies that started in the cloud, building what was cloud native 3 years ago, have been forced to shift their thinking by the extra features and extra things that AWS has brought to the table over the years. So it's all wins for any organization that can take advantage of it.
I mean, it did not feel like being forced to us. I was so happy. I was watching the features come out, like SQS queues having once and only once delivery and in order delivery. I was like, yes, I can kill that whole pile of code. Because every line of code you have is a liability. Every line of code. These should be viewed as necessary evils to meeting the business function. We've got a number of questions in the chat. Somebody said that because I've been saying I wanted to chime in, I was referring to Amazon Chime. I was not.
Oh, come on, that was me, Josh. That was it. I saw you say, hey, I'm just going to chime in here, and I just couldn't wait to actually ask you it. So since I couldn't ask you, I shared it with everybody.
Yeah, I'm just going to no comment on that one.
Being that you worked at AWS, I mean, come on, that just was like a natural thing there.
You've got to, man. No, we're like a Slack and Zoom shop and have been for a while. But let's see. DT asked, does Fugue also do the AMI management OS security updates, releasing a new updated AMI at a specified cadence such as 90 days? We don't release AMIs anymore. Fugue is a pure service. You don't have to install a thing. And it's awesome for us and it's awesome for our customers. And our support guys love this because all you have to do is share an IAM ARN for a cross-account access credential that you manage, and you can do Fugue in like 15 minutes right now and visualize and check your security on your whole cloud. So we don't do any of that stuff because we don't have to. We don't even think about it. We don't even have an operating system that we deploy to. And kind of related to that, are there any compliance implications with running Lambdas? Since they're short-lived, are they evaluated when it comes to compliance? So this is a really interesting question, because it kind of shows how we think skeuomorphically about compliance and security, by which I mean we think about the past. We think about things we're familiar with rather than addressing what's there now. So what are the security, so when you're thinking about security and compliance, what you're thinking about are the potential configurations of a thing, generally speaking. There are exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's true. A Lambda, if its source code has remained the same from run to run, the implicit contract, and in some cases explicit contract, between you and AWS is that it will do the same thing unless you screw up the source code that you put in the Lambda. So our approach at Fugue is we keep track of what the source code versions are in the Lambda, and you know if anything mutates. So that very often when people talk about security and compliance around Lambda, they're worried about things like code injection, and Fugue definitely helps you with that. And then the last one.
Josh, while you touched on that one, and in fact, I was going to jump on that question as well. With Fugue there, you're looking at the changes, and you're responsible for the code. So anything that you're doing in the code, that's your responsibility. Everything else is short-lived. You know, that's not to worry about because it's underneath the compliancy. So Fugue is already handling that for you.
Yeah, a combination of Fugue and AWS.
Yes,
right?
correct.
Because we can trust AWS that Lambda is going to run the same way.
Correct.
And then we're going to tell you if that Lambda changes at all.
Yep.
Let's see. I think there was one other one in here. Okay, in addition to non-Unix operating systems, okay, in addition to non-Unix operating systems, seems like firewalls should also be a thing of the past. Firewalls. So
complicated question.
Complicated question. A little bit of thorn on that rose. But as firewalls go, I think this is another place where people might think about things a little different in cloud. A firewall is typically TCP/IP network based in terms of what it's allowing and constraining. Properly used security groups in IAM are really identity based. They're really about trust relationships. And so it is a very different way of thinking about things. A lot of the ways that bad guys, I'll put it a different way. If you're still thinking in terms of TCP/IP boundaries and ACLs and things like that, you're probably leaving yourself exposed because of the trust relationships and networks that exist in cloud, which, by the way, are capable of being much more secure than those TCP/IP perimeter-based security approaches. So I kind of agree with you.
So there are some tricky things though, because there are certain compliance frameworks that require packet inspection as part of what you have to do with your network in certain places. PCI can be a little tricky specifically. And if you have HIPAA requirements, I would not encourage you to go into any audit with thinking that firewalls are things you don't have to consider. And I'm sure this is another area where AWS can be super helpful in helping you figure out, work with ProServe or your SAs to evaluate those types of things.
Yeah, 100%. I'm a forward-leaning software architect, so I'm always thinking about how to go next. The compliance frameworks are still really, they do have some legacy stuff. And James is exactly right. You have to respect that. And actually, that's one of the things AWS has done really well when they brought folks over like Steve Schmidt and so on, who were deeply, deeply familiar with, the traditional enterprise security requirements. What I would encourage, though, is that do not believe if you pass an audit based on those old school data center approaches. You have to meet the requirements for that, for those audits and for that scrutiny, but do not believe that that means you're secure, because a lot of these services connect to themselves, to each other in new and different ways. And that's a lot of what we've put, years of work into at Fugue, and it's non-trivial, but we're kind of at that moment. We're kind of at the Prius of computing. We've still got the internal combustion engine in it, and we've got an electric motor too, and we're having to deal with both.
Yeah, Josh, I just thought that's a good point you made, sort of where kind of maybe compliance gets you to a pretty good place as far as, getting, your environment in a fairly secure posture, if you will. But it's not everything. That you kind of have to think a little bit, that the kind of the compliance frameworks are sort of a great starting point to get you into a good spot, but you have to think beyond those frameworks to make sure that you stay secure.
Yeah, for sure. And while you were talking, one of our attendees said, "Good Prius analogy. Can't wait for the Tesla." The Tesla's Lambda. I'm telling you, that is the Tesla. So you can tell I'm a fan. But to your point, Drew, I mean, one of the most fun things that I get an opportunity to do on occasion is, and it's kind of one of those regretfully fun things. Whenever there's a big breach in the news, if there's any details on it, I'll go recreate it in the lab and figure out how the bad guys are attacking. And very often it's stuff that's absolutely not considered in any of the compliance frameworks. I'll give you one example. There was one that happened last year. I'm not going to name any names. By the way, I'm one of those people, when I see somebody have one of these breaches, I feel for them. They're usually not caused by people being like incompetent and dumb. They're caused by people not understanding how these things can relate. But I thought this one was super cool from a bad guy perspective. So an attacker found in I don't remember if it was a source code repository or an object store, or I think it might have been a volume on a forgotten about compute instance that had an attached volume, but the compute instance had a CVE. So somebody gets to database credentials. Okay, I don't remember exactly how. I think it was the EC2 instance that had been forgotten about. By the way, if you've forgotten about compute instances, that's really, really, really bad, and bad guys have found them and they're going to exploit them, and CVEs will happen to them. So it's really important, and we put a lot of work into that here to make sure you know what you're running. Found these database credentials. So I would have thought that they would have logged into the database and steal data from it. Maybe do like a slow exfiltration, right? They use those credentials and the IAM permissions of that EC2 instance to take an old snapshot of the database, but not that old, and stand up a new database cluster and exfiltrate all the data all at once. That is an absolutely cloud native attack, and I gotta say, respect. That's really cool, right? But why did they do that? Because they could stand it up in a new VPC network that wasn't being monitored. As James said, everybody's doing like PCAP and packet inspection on their known production networks, but it's an API call away to build something new, right? And you could never build a new database cluster in a data center and have it go unnoticed. But you can probably have it go unnoticed for at least hours, which is plenty of time to grab all the data out of that system in the cloud. And I'm gonna put an asterisk on that and say the fact that we now have APIs on all this infrastructure is really scary to us because we're used to the old world of the data center. But the fact that there are APIs on all this means we can actually, for the first time in history, properly secure it if we deal with it the right way. So this is not a criticism. This is saying, you know, we have to change how we think and operate. Sorry, I kind of went on for a second there. I apologize to the other panelists. If you have any.
No, and I think that's a great ending remark, actually, to bear that in mind, that you secure this all different, you look at it all different, but you have so much more power and flexibility once you go cloud native. I think that's great.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, going cloud native kind of helps deal with you know, the orphaned infrastructure problem too. You know, at least yeah, I mean, yeah, probably really helps you deal with that, especially knowing that you don't have these EC2 instances laying around that might be untagged and they're just kind of hidden from your management tools and you're not aware that they're running. And if you're not aware they're running, you're not obviously not patching them and you know, securing them. So extra benefit.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's kind of what we do all day. It's trivial to find stuff like that if you're using the APIs the right way. And so I think we're going to, I think cloud is leading us into an era of computing, which will be far more secure. But people are still, you know, we've got what, 40 years of 50 years maybe, arguably longer, of learning how to deal with network perimeter based and defense in depth security. And this stuff is pretty new to folks. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that does bring us to a nice point to end. You know, it is really interesting to think about how the kind of architectural and service decisions that you make can kind of, you know, shift that responsibility and reduce your security and compliance burden and improve the experience of your end customers. So thank you, James and John, for taking the time to join us today. This was a lot of fun. And thanks everybody out there for taking the time to participate in this. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks much.
Thanks everybody.